Okay, before anybody says it, yes, I know the title of this video is pretty spoilery, but cut me some slack on this one. There was pretty much no way for me to convey the message of this video without at least implicitly spoiling the end of Infamous 2. But regardless, there be spoilers ahead. So what is there to say about Infamous? Well, it's hard to say whether or not it's one of my favorite video game franchises of all time, given the fact that the first game has aged relatively poorly despite still being fun, and Second Son, despite being arguably the most fun game from a pure gameplay standpoint in the series, was a completely unnecessary sequel that is an egregious retcon from a conceptual level. But Infamous 2 was easily one of my favorite games of all time, managing to be an incredibly fun game in its own right, with distinctive power sets and even missions between good and evil, smooth varied gameplay with tons to do and all of it rewarding, a well-realized, detailed world ripe for exploring, but at the same time is easy to traverse thanks to satisfying and intuitive movement mechanics, and of course, the story is one of my favorite stories in the history of gaming. At first, it's a plot about the beast that was prophesized by Kessler in the previous game, showing up and kickstarting Armageddon in one of the most effective opening sequences I've ever seen in a game. But Cole's quest to try and gather the power necessary to neutralize the beast, as well as use the one object that can destroy him forever, the RFI, quickly takes on more layers as the sudden onset of a plague triggered by radiation from the very first ray sphere activation is gradually taking over and killing millions.
It's the same plague that you dealt with in Empire City, only it's more lethal now. It worked its way all the way down the coast, so it was only a matter of time before it hit New Marais. Now it is raging out of control. So many people are sick or dead already. There are more bodies than people can bury.
Wow. Maybe the beast isn't the worst thing that could happen to this town.
Meanwhile, the beast's rampage is shown not to be a rampage of mindless destruction, but rather a rampage of evolution, as he's using his powers to activate dormant conduits, as they're the only ones immune to the radiation. So the plot ceases to be about black and white morality, and becomes a decision between either conduits or humans coming to an end, and neither can be placed as the true right decision, and no matter what you pick, it's gonna be tear-jerking. You have a unique cast of distinct but equally likable, sympathetic characters that each justify the clash in morality, but in a natural way. I like all these characters. Cole, Quo, Nix, and especially Zeke, whose brotherly dynamic with Cole makes for some of the most emotionally impactful moments you'll see in a game. Especially in light of their fractured relationship from the last game. An apocalyptic level threat that feels earned and acts as a compelling through line front to back and makes for some really great drama and missions. But despite those stakes, it manages to have some levity here and there that doesn't break the tone.
Hey, stop! Whoa! Stop shooting the thermonuclear missile! Dumb hicks!
And most of all, it is bold. It does not chicken out. Nothing about how this game plays out makes anything easy. If you side with the beast, you're forced to kill Zeke in a prolonged manner where you get to see his desperate and futile attempts to fight back in painstaking slow motion. Really, really heartbreaking. But meanwhile, if you side with the humans to fight the beast and decide to use the RFI, you destroy the beast and neutralize the plague, but in the process, Cole sacrifices himself as well as every conduit activated or dormant across the world. Truly a shocking ending that I don't think anybody saw coming. Now, according to Nate Fox, he intended for the evil ending to be the canon ending. Naturally, it is the ending that's vastly easier to continue off from. However, player data suggested that more people were choosing the good ending over the evil ending, and that became the deciding factor as to which ending was the canon one. At least that's what the internet tells me. And to this day, the good ending is still a source of debate among Infamous fans as to whether or not Cole should have been brought back, or whether he was even dead to begin with. Because to some, the bolt of lightning at the end of Infamous 2 was meant to indicate that he's still alive, as opposed to what it came across to me as just an exclamation point to the ending of the game. And I think at this point, all these years later, to view it as anything else is just looking for any reason to believe Cole isn't dead. And there's a rather large chunk of fans of the series who never wanted Cole to die, who still believe that he either should have come back or in any hypothetical sequel will come back. I, however, think the opposite is true. Not only do I think he should stay dead, I think bringing Cole back would literally be the worst possible route a sequel could have gone, at least if we're following on from the good ending, and I don't think it should really be hard to understand why. It was essentially a perfect death, something that is very rare in fiction. Now, what exactly is it that makes a good character death? Well, that's not exactly an easy question to answer because it varies from genre to genre and even medium to medium. I feel like in TV or movies, it's not exactly hard to have a meaningful death that satisfies audiences, and it's a lot more common because on one hand, there's not as much of an inherent connection between viewers watching and the characters, and I feel like in certain cases, TV and movie audiences are generally more used to seeing characters die. For example, if you get into Game of Thrones expecting your favorite characters to not bite it, you're gonna have a bad time. Whereas I think video games have the toughest time with character death out of any medium. For one thing, video games require the presence of a controllable character, and so generally speaking, there's an inherent expectation of survival because in most cases you can't just kill off the main character at least before the end of the game, and of course there are sequels to think about. So on average, main character death is extremely rare in video games, so audiences are conditioned to expect their favorite characters to have a level of plot armor because of that. Gamers are not used to seeing their favorite characters die. And what makes it even harder is the fact that because we're controlling these characters, we have an inherent connection with them in between player and player character, and so we're invested in their survival because their survival is our survival in a sense. These roadblocks make main character death in video games much harder to do well, and even when it's done well, you're still gonna have a contingent of people who don't like it just because of the understanding of the whole plot armor aspect. There's a natural impulse to viscerally reject character death in video games, so with all that in mind, it's nearly impossible to do a perfect death, and that's why you shouldn't just wantonly throw one away when you get it. Infamous 2's good story, and especially the good ending, was a heartbreaking and difficult storyline to sit through for the most part. Even I will admit back when I first played the game, I hated the ending because I didn't want the story to end, and I didn't want to believe that one of my favorite video game characters was going to have such a definitive ending. Which in my opinion is also an incredibly immature attitude because it was also the perfect ending. It's not to say it's the only way the characters could have ended, but it's perfect for what it is. Consider the fact that this was essentially perfectly built for what it was. If it was some sort of cheap death that was done for shock value and didn't feel earned, yeah, I would have a problem with it, and I'd want them to walk it back, but this is one of the more earned deaths that I've ever experienced in fiction, and that's because everything that built up to it was so expertly handled. The plague was such an afterthought in the first game. In fact, if I remember correctly, it was only ever mentioned one time. So the way it comes up, almost as a matter-of-fact second act twist in Infamous 2, comes as a shock. This killer aspect of the plot hijacks the main antagonist status from the Beast, but then there's the way they're able to integrate it into the established story. The fact that it was caused by Rayfield radiation essentially means Cole is at best partially responsible for what is sure to be the end of humanity. The way it's established that the Beast's intentions are to try to preserve some semblance of humanity even if it means the deaths of millions. And then there's Zeke. Like I said, Zeke is peak. The way he's able to evolve from comedy relief side character to untrustworthy ass to eventually take his place as a true hero of the story, deciding to put his neck on the line multiple times despite being the only one of the quartet without powers, really shows his bravery and just how much he does value his friendship with Cole. So when they pull the twist at the 11th hour that Zeke himself is infected with the plague, it really hits home on a personal level just how massive a threat the plague is. Up to this point, the plague has been evident and definitely apparent, but this is the first time it's affected anyone so close to us, and now we understand how far-reaching it is. And that's not even to mention this absolutely haunting news briefing.
More plague victims are surfacing across the East Coast at a frightening rate. An estimated 50 million people are now infected with the disease, and every case so far has been fatal. Virologist Henry Marsh with the CDC told us more about what we're dealing with. The new plague is unlike anything they've seen before. He said the mysterious nature of the disease makes it nearly impossible to treat. The pathogen doesn't behave in conventional ways. It's neither bacterial nor viral. There have been no reports of cases outside the US, but the World Health Organization is already calling it a Phase 6 emerging pandemic and is preparing for the worst. The CDC warns that a vaccine could come too late. In light of these events, I've decided to take a leave of absence in order to spend a little more time with my family. I hope all of you can do the same. God bless you all. US TV News, signing off.
By this point, we're basically fully aware that the plague has a 100% mortality rate, so this is not some joke. This is essentially a death sentence for your best friend. So between the world-ending stakes, the moral ambiguity of the Beast's intentions, Zeke's impending death, and Cole feeling personally responsible for all of it, it sets up the story having essentially the largest possible stakes it ever could hope to have, and none of it feels forced or half-assed. It's presented with enough weight, enough conviction, and enough haunting realism to feel compellingly close to home. It's built up incredibly well over the entire course of the game. There are many twists and turns before you're given the final decision, and most of all these characters are incredibly likable. Except for this guy. So it had the stakes, the writing, and the characters to back it up. So to me, the possibility of a sacrifice in and amongst a total apocalyptic scenario like this is possibly the absolute best way you could do a heroic sacrifice like this. At least in a larger-than-life scenario like a superhero sandbox. The entire thing felt earned. This truly did feel like a scenario where nothing could have ever possibly topped it, and so they decided they weren't gonna top it. They decided to end the story in the best possible way, and the whole game has not only a real sense of finality, but it also goes as far as being integrated into the theming. This is a game about endings and new beginnings. Practically every character has an old life they're forced to leave behind, and are having to deal with the consequences of starting fresh. Zeke and Cole have to deal with the prospect of leaving Empire City after it's destroyed and going to New Moray. Quo has to deal with transforming into a conduit and being forced to leave behind her secret agent status, and Nyx was forced out of her life in a very similar way to Quo, but obviously landed on the opposite side of the same coin. And then you have Bertrand, Cole, and the Beast, who each represent 3 potential new beginnings for the human race. Obviously, those being the destruction of humans, the destruction of conduits, or the total takeover of cloned conduits. No matter what takes place, it has calamitous consequences. I'd imagine these themes are partially why a key moment in the game has Cole and Zeke say this to each other.
Into the road.
Cheers, brother. Half as long.
Twice as bright.
Half as long, twice as bright. That's these characters, this game, and this series overall, choosing to burn out half as long as the other games around it, but go out twice as bright. It's all staring you in the face, and it was incredibly brave to do, which, if you ask me, is exactly why this should have been the end of the series, and if nothing else, I'm glad they never decided to bring Cole back. I think it would be almost entirely disrespectful to the character, as well as an incredible cop-out if he was ever brought back, because you completely downplay or nullify the sacrifice he made. In fact, I found that even continuing the series at all with Second Son inherently hurt the message that Infamous 2 was trying to get across with its sense of finality, and so by undoing that in any way, it just retroactively hurt the story. But at the very least, they resisted the urge of bringing Cole back, because if they did, it would render every single thing about this story and about this absolutely fantastic ending utterly and completely pointless, which would be the absolute worst thing to happen to a story like this. Sure, it's sad, but sometimes we need fiction to challenge us. Sometimes we need something that's sad and heartfelt. Because the most memorable experiences are the ones that make us feel the most. Is there a version of Infamous 2 where there's a much simpler story where you deal with Bertrand or the militia or both, and it's a much simpler story where you don't have to have the large stakes or heroic sacrifices, and it can just be a nice simple happy ending for all involved? And or maybe even the Beast doesn't necessarily need to be a morally complex being, and we can just have nice simple morals with a nice happy ending with endless potential for sequels? I mean, yeah, I'm sure that could exist, but it would suck, at least comparatively. But there's no use in dealing in hypotheticals here because this is the game we were given. Besides, on balance, a story with finality is infinitely more palatable to me than something that's just generic and allows itself to be endlessly sequeled. I would happily take one fantastic game that tugs on my heartstrings over generic sequels that don't push the envelope. Every story has to end whether you like it or not, and would you rather it end in the best possible way at the perfect time when ideas are still fresh, where you leave nothing on the table and leave the audience wanting more? Or would you rather it get milked until it dies? If the latter, well, I think that's an incredibly immature attitude. Because here's an uncomfortable truth. You either end a finished story, or you go on long enough to see yourself end on a cliffhanger. And hey, there are certain franchises out there that do have the potential to go on theoretically infinitely. Things like Mario or Zelda are specifically designed to have every game operate as though it's the first game, and they don't get too caught up in the characters or the world. They're just designed to be fun games. But the more heavily you characterize your games, the easier it is to get stale, and the easier it is to notice when it's getting stale, when you start to run out of things to do with the characters. There's a reason why Uncharted only went 4 main entries. I think the only reason that anybody could ever want to bring Cole back in a future installment has nothing to do with how good it could potentially be, but rather just for the sake of bringing him back because we like him. But I think to like Cole MacGrath as a character as well as like the series requires you to understand why his sacrifice was so important and how taking it away could inherently undermine everything that the character ever meant, undermine the finality, undermine the story, and completely disregard one of the most well-written, complete story arcs I've ever seen in a game. All for the sake of bringing someone back that ultimately doesn't really need to be brought back for any real reason other than, I just want it. That's the impression I get, is that nobody can give me any one solid reason why Cole MacGrath shouldn't have died or why he should come back other than I just want more games. And that, my friends, is why I am happy that Cole MacGrath never came back in an Infamous sequel and why you should be too. No matter how many clues, half-assed theories, or straws one can grasp onto. And even if the story didn't ultimately work for you personally, surely you could admit that undoing the story would be completely detrimental to the series as a whole, and has no reason to happen other than to just get more games for the sake of getting more games. At this point, what good reason would you be doing it for? I'd like to know. Although it's funny, I remember one time I was asked about how I would make an Infamous sequel that wouldn't harm Infamous 2's story, and I explained my pitch, and it was pointed out to me multiple times that my idea for an ideal sequel was basically just The Force Unleashed 2, which is really funny to me. To be clear, I've never actually played that game. Well, that's my piece. Hopefully I've made a coherent point. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Let me know in the comment section, and don't forget to like and subscribe and hit the notification icon so you're always up to date on what I'm doing. And if you want to support me in a more direct fashion, you can pledge to my Patreon for unique perks and rewards such as early access, Discord benefits, and exclusive content along with these fine folks right here. And an extra special thank you to Billy Knott, Brooklyn, Gaw004, Cotton Swab, Christopher Fulton, Layabout, My Name is Tank, Raph, Twisted Wishes, Ty Trovey, and Weird Webster for going above and beyond. I've been the King of Snark Style right here on Tactical Bacon Productions, and I will see you next time. Stay crispy, my friends.